glad everyone could join us for this this month's Heads and Chairs webinar for AGU and AGI, part of our overall program support of the departments. First, a few introductions. Pranoti Asher, who's Manager of Higher Education for AGU and also AGI Scholar in Residence, is on the line. She's in the dark. We had some bad weather here in DC, but she is following along on her phone. And myself, Christopher Keene, here at AGI, Director of Geoscience Profession and Higher Education. And I'm joined by my colleague, Leila Gonzalez, who's also helping me moderate out today's webinar. So with that, it's my pleasure to, and I guess, Greg, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
I am working on that right now.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'll introduce our two speakers today. Greg Tannenbaum, who is the head of Open Research Funders Group, and Loretta Parham, who is the CEO and director of the AUC Woodruff Library. We'll be talking today about an effort, a roundtable effort that's coming out of the National Academies that they are having a key component, and we'll be discussing the issues of aligning incentives to open research.
Thanks so much, and thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. Loretta and I are both quite pleased to speak with you. What we're going to do is we're going to talk specifically about a project of the National Academies, a roundtable that's been spun up in the last year or so, and what its aims are in terms of aligning incentives for open science practices. And then we want to dig specifically into how this relates to you and your interest and what may be happening or what may be under discussion in geosciences, to understand if there is an opportunity for partnership here, to work together to recognize what I think are probably some shared goals. So without further ado, I'm just going to dig in here. And I thought I would start by giving you an overview of the project itself, the roundtable. So again, the NASM has established the Roundtable on Aligning Incentives for Open Science, which is a multi-year project bringing together critical stakeholders to fundamentally improve the correlation between open practices, credit and reward systems, and research missions and values. And I'll get into the specifics of what that means on the next slide. But in terms of who we are, we are bringing together senior leaders from universities, from philanthropies, from government agencies, from professional societies, from foundations, from industry, to discuss incentives for adopting open science practices, current barriers, current disincentives, and ways that we can work with specific communities and specific disciplines to develop hiring and review and tenure and promotion and funding practices that are consistent with our shared values. The bottom line with the roundtable is that we, as funders, as universities, as government agencies, we're trying to tackle big societal challenges, right? We're pursuing the mysteries of science and nature. We're attempting to gain a better understanding of the human condition and our place in the universe. And the fundamental principles that undergird open science are key accelerators potentially of that mission. So the rapid sharing of research results, the rapid sharing of underlying data, the democratization of information, further collaboration, rewarding big research questions rather than just small incremental answers. Those are practices that we can put in place that will help us in furtherance of these missions, and not surprisingly are consistent with open science practices. So the roundtable is bringing together, as I said, a range of stakeholders. And what we want to do is we want to discuss, we want to develop, and we want to deploy open science plans that are both consistent with common norms and are also appropriate for their specific communities. So our focus is when we think about this guidance, is really on thinking about the points of leverage that individual stakeholders manage and how those points of leverage can be activated to create better alignment across research values, practices, and incentives. So put very succinctly, incentives are the tools that we use to ensure that research practices are consistent with the organizational values that we espouse. And we have a number of working groups that are tasked with producing actionable guidance and resources for, again, for university leadership, for academic department chairs, for research funders, for government agencies. And we're trying to lay out both the why, the reasons that will entice institutions and agencies and funders to properly align their credit and reward systems with open science practices, but also the how, the practical means by which they can do so. And when we talk about the roundtable, I just want to give you a sense of the types of organizations that are involved. We're really lucky to have Loretta Parham here, who is a member of the roundtable, and we'll talk about her experiences in just a moment. But as you can see, we really have representation from a really interesting cross-section of stakeholders. And there are top-level folks who are involved here. I mean, it's vice chancellors and vice provosts and presidents and university librarians and senior leadership of agencies and funders and so forth. So we have, we believe, we have the right people at the table, and that's obviously an important first step. So really, I think what I'd like to do is, as I've talked about having the right people around the table, I'd like to turn it over to one of those right people who's with us here, Loretta Parham, who wants to talk, I think, specifically about some of the issues that resonate with her and her constituents as she approaches this work. So Loretta, I will steer and you just tell me when to advance, and I think away you go.
Absolutely. Thank you, Greg. And good morning, good evening to all others participating. So this slide we start with, we say, really, why does open matter to you? And that's a question that I often have heard from faculty within the Atlanta University Center, which is in Atlanta. I think what we want to suggest, what I want to say is that for anyone who wants to share their research process or sample the data that they're gathering along the way during the process of developing their research, and for anyone who may see a benefit to having input and feedback from others within the field of study, then open science provides the means for this. The current model that we are all working under, usually, of sharing information, is traditionally or has been traditionally positioned by publishers, and it simply does not allow for the kind of open and collaborative development of research as we are talking about today. And that's largely because of structures that reserve property rights for those other than the author or the authors. So this is a significant change to the model for sharing research. It is also another reason why this really should matter to you is because of, I'll just use the word more as I have here. My goodness, when we're conducting research, the outcome of that is that more people can read your findings. And this happens while in the process of developing those findings and at the conclusion. So we're not waiting to the end of everything. The timing around this is something that is not possible under the traditional model. Also, in terms of more, you are introduced or welcoming the input of others who can expand the work by virtue of their involvement, and they can reuse the work as well. More readers and more collaborators results in more pointers to your work, more citations, and I believe everyone sees that as a huge benefit to research, but more citations, in other scholarly materials. And finally, it means that your name and that of the institution that is sponsoring your research gain greater visibility and acknowledgement. And that is quite significant. So in terms of why open matters to information professionals and librarians, it matters because really it is a perfect fit with the professional values that we support and espouse. As librarians, we have a professional obligation to strive for free access to all information resources, regardless of the library type. But most certainly in the academic library, this really bears more fruit it can bear greater fruit. We, as librarians and information professionals, we operate with an objective to cast a net that is as wide as possible, providing many persons access to information and research. The open science movement speaks to this with an emphasis upon early access to data, notes, policies, tools, and more. Access that occurs from the start of planning of research through to the end of that scholarly activity. Research advances by timely sharing and open communications. With your library investing in resources and tools, kits, and equipment such as digital repositories, it is able to implement strategies for sharing content using those platforms that can facilitate the creation and preservation of scholarly communications. The repositories also provide local control over what is in the repository and how it is accessed. Another reason it matters to my colleagues, other librarians, and information professionals is that it purposes that it is a great opportunity, we would say, for faculty to collaborate with the university librarians for purposes of impact of institutional policies. You put a librarian together with a faculty member and something great, I promise you, happens. But in this conversation, policies that influence academic and scientific research, for example, property rights policies that of the institution, tenure and promotion, etc., they are complemented by this collaboration between faculty, the research and scholarly community, and the university librarian. So we are always happy as librarians to inform and support faculty who may want a little assistance with introduction and implementation of open science in your department and on your campuses. So we care greatly, but it is a movement that should be led by faculty. Finally, I would say, just as I share these comments here with you, I offer these quotes which come from the SPARC website. SPARC is the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, to which many research level institutions, libraries, and others are members. But these succinct statements of why librarians and information professionals are such advocates kind of speak to that reason. Again, it is about shared values for access to information. It is about knowledge advancement, scholarship, and economics, reducing the amount and the number of times that your institution is paying for access to your work. There exists an open science taxonomy documented by the Foster Open Science, which I did not place up here because it's a rather busy taxonomy, but I encourage you to take a look at it, again, with the fosteropenscience.org, that lays out relationships within open science. And these relationships speak to open access, open data, reproducible research, evaluation policies, and tools. And it visually defines the ways in which the open science should be approached. So the importance of engaging academic leadership, provosts and chairs, is critical. It's critical if these approaches are to be adopted and valued for purposes of tenure and promotion, scholarly communications, and institutional advancement. So it does indeed matter, we believe, to all concerned. Greg?
So there's a special role for both provosts and chairs to play in these conversations. We had alluded earlier to this idea of having working groups that are helping to carry the load for this roundtable. And one of the working groups is specifically called the Provost and Chair Working Group. And it comes specifically out of some work that has been happening at MIT. And the chair, quite fortuitously for us, the chair of this working group is the head of libraries from MIT, who's actually the point person there for this project on campus. And in a nutshell, the idea here is the university, in this case MIT, has an interest in advancing open science and open scholarship policies. It does not have the appetite for setting forth uniform and prescriptive policies that would apply to all departments. It just doesn't make sense. What the needs and interests are for the history department are very different from the geosciences department, and very different again from the biomedical departments, let's say. So what MIT has done is it has said the provost is going to work with individual department chairs to come up with policies and procedures that are appropriate for that department and that discipline. And in practice, how this has worked is the department chairs have been asked to come up with ideas for advancing open science, not necessarily going 100% open right away, but incremental steps that can be taken that will create a clear signal both within the department and across the institution that the trend, the movement is towards open. And this strikes us as a model that is potentially replicable, as we like to say, both vertically and horizontally. And by vertically, I mean within an institution, this is something that can be replicated across many to all departments. And horizontally, what we mean is some of the policies that may arise in a geoscience department at University X may be perfectly appropriate for geoscience departments in University Y and University Z. In other words, the disciplinary norms are by definition going to inform policy development. So why don't we see if we can get a disciplinary cohort together to discuss what makes sense for the discipline. So we, as the roundtable and as this provost and chair working group, we are having lots and lots of conversations, both horizontally and vertically, as it were. So we're trying to see if within given institutions, we can get a critical mass of departments to work with their provost to have these conversations. And we're trying to have conversations at a disciplinary level to see if there's an appetite for developing common language that's reinforcing across institutions. Obviously, that's what brings us here today. We're very, very excited to be able to talk to you about this. We're having similar conversations with societies and associations in linguistics and in psychology right now, and there are a few others that are teed up. And really what we've done in practice is we've contacted a number of departments that we knew would be interested in open science or are already working towards open policies. And we said, the roundtable organizers want to arrange a brief conversation to walk you and to the extent that they might be interested, your academic leadership through the goals of our roundtable and see if we can talk together about the types of outputs, the types of considerations an open science plan that works for you and your colleagues might encompass, what language could be developed that would enforce those policies or inform those policies rather, what supporting materials would be helpful to have discussions with your peers and with your academic leadership, and really to help you frame out what a plan, a provisional plan would look like for your department, given institutional and disciplinary norms. We want to make sure that as we have those conversations, that it's clear that it's not a directive from the university, it's not a directive from the National Academies to immediately change your procedures to measure and incentivize open science activities. Quite to the contrary, really what it is an attempt to engage in a dialogue, to explore policies, to explore language, to explore timelines that are appropriate for you and your community. So we know that our conversations with the geosciences community are really just beginning, but we want to see if there's an appetite for developing in effect, a coalition of the willing within the discipline. So, our experience really has been that again, alluding to this vertical and horizontal approach, that both are necessary. We want to make sure if a researcher is hearing from their academic leadership and from their peers in the discipline that there is this movement afoot, the combination of those inputs is really powerful in changing perceptions, changing attitudes, changing behaviors. And that's why this collaboration is potentially so critical to the process. One of the animating factors behind the discipline-specific approach is best typified by this quote, right? So we talked to a lot of different department chairs, and across disciplines, we consistently heard, look, we want to make sure that what we're asking of our job applicants, of our early career researchers, of our peers, is consistent with what they're hearing from other institutions. And another way to look at that, this language is perhaps a more frank recitation of the problem statement, but really we want to make sure, department chairs want to make sure that any open policies they implement are right for their faculty, and by necessity, that also means that these policies really do have to align with the norms and practices of the wider discipline. And just for one specific example here, imagine that there's an early career researcher at University A, and they're asked by their department to post their data sets in open repositories so that the larger geosciences community can build upon them. And University A acknowledges in its tenure and promotion guidelines that this takes some effort and may have the consequence of reducing the total number of papers or articles that a researcher can crank out or can extract from that data set before it's released to the wild. So if that researcher goes onto the job market and the application guidelines at universities B, C, and D give no weight to the open sharing of data, there's perhaps an implicit penalty that gets applied to the researcher because they could have been spending their efforts and their time elsewhere, and that would be a really negative outcome, right? And so we want to coordinate our activities to help mitigate that concern. And we actually see examples of this type of disciplinary coordination in the field today. In the interest of time, I'm only going to cite one. It's an illustration, but there certainly are more that can be drawn. So it's increasingly common for psychology departments to use language like what you see on this slide in their job posting. So this is from the University of Oregon, a recent listing, but there are dozens that are available in the open science framework where these are captured. There are dozens that are roughly similar, and you can just see it says, our department embraces the values of open and reproducible science, and candidates are strongly encouraged to address in their statements how they have pursued and or plan to pursue these goals in their work. And to the extent that this is increasingly common in job postings in psychology, at the very, very least, it's a conversation starter, right? It's a signal that this is something the department values. I think that those signals are quite meaningful. So what we have done as the Roundtable is we've used real world examples like what we saw from the University of Oregon, as well as extensive conversations with Roundtable members, with their networks, with department chairs, with professional associations. We've used those conversations to draft language, not only for job postings, but also for annual reporting. And to be clear, I'm not expecting that you would simply, Loretta and I are not expecting that you would simply take this language back to your department and implement it as it is. What we see it is as a starting point of a multilateral conversation. We want to talk to you. We want to talk to your departmental colleagues. We want to talk to your administration. We want to talk to the AGI and the and the AGU. And we want to talk to the larger geosciences universe to understand what really resonates within the community and what feels viable within the community. So what are we really asking here? The first step is to understand who actually cares about this enough to engage. So obviously the fact that you're on this call means you have at least a curiosity about it. Presumably there are other folks who might be interested who are just unable or unaware of this webinar, but that we could engage as well. But the bottom line is we know that in the abstract, people are inclined to support the open sharing of research. But that said, this project really requires people to take that notional approval and translate it into real policies affecting real scholars doing real research. And we get that that's a non-trivial request. But assuming we can establish a cohort, as we've done in psychology, as we've done in linguistics, what we'd then like to do is we'd really like to talk about how this language that we've developed for job postings, for annual reporting, potentially for tenure and promotion, how we can adapt and adopt that for this community so that it really reflects the range of research outputs that are most important within the geosciences, how we can make sure that it represents appropriate and attainable open practices for this discipline. And assuming that we accomplish steps 1 and step 2, we then like to work with this coalition of department chairs and the AGI and the AGU to socialize the proposed language and the proposed guidance, any resources we develop to help with the implementation. We want to circulate that to the wider geosciences community. We want to incorporate their feedback and sort of lather, rinse, and repeat, if you will. And then we want to talk about the best ways to socialize these plans on campuses. You know, how do we engage with your provost? How do we broach this subject with your departmental colleagues in a way that draws them in rather than puts them off? We're already building our experiences along these dimensions, and we believe that we can, in effect, construct a community of practice to make these tasks maybe feel a little bit less daunting. One of the things that's nice about this occurring under the auspices of the National Academies is when we contact provosts, when we contact presidents, when we contact vice presidents of research, they will take the call. We can work through APLU, we can work through AAU, we can work through lots of other organizations in a way that gives us visibility and helps us cut through the clutter, which is obviously helpful. In terms of what we are going to do beyond just using our imprimatur to get those conversations started, we really do see the Roundtable as an organizing body here. So we can obviously, again, use the National Academies brand to get people's attention, but we can also pull in experts on open science. We can pull in experts on organizational behavior or academic incentives or social change to help us chart a path to adoption that has the best likelihood of success. So as just one very discrete example, we have a working group that is engaged with the author of a book called How Behavior Spreads, which is helping us to understand the science of complex social contagions. So basically how to take a good idea and get it adopted at scale. We really think that we can bring together the subject matter expertise. We can get virtually anyone we need to take our calls. We can pull together a set of resources that we think gets the discussion started within geosciences. And we can do a lot of the heavy operational lifting in terms of materials generation, meeting coordination, and so forth. And together, I think we have I know we have a high degree of confidence that we can, at the very least, engage in a well-informed discussion with a good likelihood of success. Again, success here is the development and the deployment at scale of appropriate, consistent, and reinforcing open science policies at geosciences departments across the country and eventually across the world. So, you know, what we've heard so far across not just geosciences, but other disciplines as well, is that, not surprisingly, disciplinary coordination is key. Obviously understanding people who are going to be out on the job market, what they care about, what they're being asked to do, what they can give attention to, those things matter. We've heard also, for example, that when external reviewers are requested to provide feedback on a candidate, giving them clear instructions about what the department values, what they prioritize, and examples of that within the realm of open science that's an example of we can probably coordinate that. It doesn't need to be created de novo at each institution. We're also aware that departments control some, but not all, points of leverage. Hiring and annual reporting are great examples. Things like the tenure and promotion dossier, the language that goes into tenure and promotion instructions, we know that we have to coordinate at a higher level, at the university level, having those conversations. And we also know that it's not enough to simply change the language, to add language like we saw in the University of Oregon Psychology Department job posting. We also have to have some form of training, right? So early career researchers, for example, need to understand what good open science practices are. We know that there are a number of universities that are actually baking this into research methods training, for example. We also know that the folks who are, it's not enough to report in an annual faculty update what I have done to make my work more open and how others have used it as a consequence. There needs to be the ability for those who are getting those reports and evaluating them, or getting job applications and evaluating them. They need to be able to understand what represents good open science, what represents good practice, so that they can do proper evaluation. So again, we're aware that these are tasks that are at hand. At a higher level, there are always reservations. There are always reasons to not do things. That said, the objections that we've heard thus far are practical and surmountable. They're surmountable if there is proper support from university administration, if there's proper support from funders, from agencies, and so forth. If there is reinforcing that goes on, if what individual researchers are hearing from their department, from their university, from their funders, et cetera, and so forth, that is consistent, that will go a long way. There is absolutely, and we may be biased in who we're talking to, but there is consensus that open science is the right thing to do, and there's an eagerness to also make it the easy thing to do. So that's critical, right? So people want to do it, but people are busy. So how do we make it easier? That obviously really matters. And in terms of how we can potentially coordinate our activities, we're really interested in talking with you about common language, common approaches to hiring practices, to tenure and promotion reviews, and to annual faculty reports. That middle bullet point, I'll say, we know that the latitude that individual departments have, as I mentioned before, they may be somewhat constrained, and we have to level up and talk to university administration as well. But those are conversations, obviously, we can bake into the larger discussion. But in terms of geosciences, how do open activities currently factor into how you're thinking about tenure and promotion, how you're thinking about hiring, how you're thinking about annual reporting, thinking about ideally where we're trying to get, what the barriers are that are preventing us from getting there, and how we can collaborate to overcome them. I don't think anything on that slide will come as a surprise to you. And then, again, specifically within geosciences, thinking about if we can come up with a blueprint that makes sense for the discipline, who do we need to engage in order to speed adoption? Who are the people whose early support would really be an important signal? How do we as the Roundtable help facilitate that? And really, if we're meeting again in a year, what does success look like? What can we say reasonably we want to attain between now and then? And really, this is the bottom line, is we want to have a conversation. We don't have a specific prescription here. We want to open a dialogue. Because this is a geology group, and because I sort of, as a rule of thumb, think that it's a statute that if there's a deck of 10 or more slides, there has to be some play on words or some awful pun. There's your closing graphic. But I'll just say that I do hope that this transition to open as the default doesn't occur on a geologic timescale. I hope that we feel some sense of urgency, and we can develop this coalition of the willing, and we can get to practical action sooner rather than later. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing my screen, and I think we'll open it up to discussion. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and your attention.
Thank you, Greg. Well, we try to see if there are other questions. One question I have for you, when you look at the other communities that you've talked with, do they feel that effectively the organizational and technical infrastructures are available to them, both in their university department, the societies, their primary funders, to accelerate this? So, are there other areas where they feel that they've got a leg up and it's really just a social exercise, or is it reversed or something like that? Just sort of curious what your sort of map looks like with other groups. Within
geosciences, sorry, or across disciplines, you mean?
In other disciplines, since you've been talking to quite a few of the disciplines.
Yeah, I think this model that we proffered is this sort of coalition of the willing approach, whether it's 5 departments to start with or 15. The idea that we can talk and really through those conversations gain an understanding of what the types of materials that should be covered under a policy are in terms of a phase 1 approach, what the language that we can reasonably implement in the near term looks like, and what sort of the long-term open questions or unknowns are. I feel like we've had good success in being able to come up with that consensus relatively efficiently. So through a relatively small number of conversations, we've been able to come up with language and plans that those that are a part of the cohort feel very comfortable with and are comfortable not just taking back to their individual institutions, but socializing with their peers at other institutions. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, well, thank you. So we have a couple questions from the audience. So this one is from James Gooding. The version of OA that you described today in the context of geosciences seems plausible only for academic research that's funded by government sources such as NSF, NOAA, or NASA, where OA might be acceptable. Any research funded by ARPA, DARPA, DoD, or private industry, which includes application-oriented geoscience, will have restrictions on data sharing and publication. What do you see as the realistic boundaries for OA so that its application is not too narrow to be a substantial barrier?
It's a very good question. Thanks, James. And you're right that there are certain areas where the open model doesn't fit. Another example, not quite as relevant to this group, but I think one that's worth stating is sometimes in biomedical research, there's human subject data that can't reasonably be de-identified. So if you're looking at a study in a specific town or a specific village or a specific demographic, it's virtually impossible to fully de-identify it. So no one is suggesting that everything should be made fully openly available, darn the consequences. I do think the answer to your question really is to push along 2 dimensions. One is to talk to organizations like ARPA, DARPA, DoD to make sure that the line is drawn properly. So there are things that can be kept out of the public domain because they really can't be shared. And then there are ones where if you have a conversation, that doesn't quite hold up. And so engaging those organizations to understand where the line exists, which is one of the things the Roundtable is currently doing, is an example. And then the other part is, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. So there will be research, there will be data, there will be outputs that cannot be openly shared. Okay, well, sticking a pin in those, there are still lots of resources, lots of research outputs that can be openly shared that are not presently being openly shared. And so let's focus on that that low-hanging fruit first, because there's enough to keep us sated for the immediate future.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, this is Loretta. I would add to that clearly, where it is a fit, as you suggested, within the government sources, if it works there, then it becomes a model for those other funded areas to perhaps rethink and reframe even some of the policies which are guiding some of those private funders and those more sensitive areas for data collection.
Okay. So we have a question from Steve Holbrook. I may have missed this, but what are some of the specific practices covered in quote unquote open science? Is this open access publishing only, as or evaluating data sets, preprint servers, ultrametrics? Do you have some sort of what you see as sort of product kind of points?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Steve, the answer is we actually have another working group that's tasked with looking at the range of research outputs. So when we think about research outputs, we tend to think about papers and or data, and then everything else. I mean, it varies by discipline, but largely speaking, that's true. And of course, there are a whole range of other research outputs that we should be considering. So you're right that preprints are certainly in the mix. Code, software, monographs, presentations. These will vary by discipline. And in addition to identifying the different types of research outputs that should be considered for an open policy, we're trying to develop some guidance about what proper open sharing would look like for those particular resources. But what I do think is critical, and why I think this disciplinary approach really matters to such a degree, is we should have conversations with those people in geosciences about what resources really should be the focus of our attention when it comes to open policies and open language. Having saying this is what you should do with a monograph, that doesn't resonate in geosciences, right? So I think we can present a laundry list of here are lots of different research outputs that we've heard about across the different disciplines. Let's really focus on the ones that are most meaningful for this community.
Okay.
May I add to that? Yeah, I would say also, I mean, Steve, you're asking about what are some of the practices that are covered, within that, in addition to the ones that Greg is mentioning to you. I tend to think that the other practices, the other areas in which this open science, where you have an opportunity to take advantage of the open science and open access movement, has to do with not the big data and not, as Greg said, not only monograms, graphs and books, but journals, standards, even your lab notebooks, workflow procedures. Procedures are a huge opportunity for sharing of that scholarly input, guidelines, testing, etc. So it has an opportunity to touch upon all the products of the research process itself.
That's good. So we have more of a comment from Luciana Astiz. Funding through NSF grants require OA for data. Some projects can have an embargo for a short period of time. However, there is a trend that data should be accessible almost in real time for many community-driven projects. But I think this actually brings up another question: is we're talking about incentives, and let's look at tenure and promotion for a second. And I'm curious if you guys have discussed this. When for geoscience, when we shifted from a lot of mapping to more computer analytics, there was a bit of a rough patch. When those that sit in judgment, that wasn't how they did it, kind of situation, and so there was some resistance to some of those new methods, and then eventually you get through it. And I think the one question is, in geoscience, a lot of the research is fairly location specific, and a lot of times in any given effort to develop a data set, by a researcher, they are able to get a fair number of papers out of it. If that is now open, then potentially they may not be able to, shall we say, beat the competition, because if this location specific knowledge is now available out there, yet you have faculty that maybe are looking at a tenure decision, saying, well, when I was doing this, we had X number of papers were our expectation versus say what you're being productive at, but they have other challenges in this place. Has there been discussions about how, in the fine level of more than just adoption, but how it could interact with the cultural decisions and relationships within sort of the academic community as you move into this work?
No, it's a really, really well observed point, and I have a few comments. So one is, there absolutely should be a first mover advantage. I understand that there should be a first mover advantage for the person who created the data, who compiled the data, who did the study, and so forth. However, that shouldn't extend sort of into infinity, right? So if your almost all work, much of scientific work is supported by someone, right? It's funded by the federal government, it's funded by philanthropies, it's funded by the university, and those organizations have an interest in the spread of knowledge, the advancement of understanding, and so that interest is inconsistent with a single individual hoarding the data indefinitely because they have vague hopes of extracting another paper from the research. And so there's a tension there for sure. It's resolvable, right? So I think we're finding ways where a number of agencies and funders are saying, you can have sole use of the data unless and until the point where you publish a first paper off of it, and at that point you have to make it available. So that that's an example. But the other point you raise is about how we pivot into what we view as impact and what we view as important within the field, and how that relates to hiring and career advancement, tenure, promotion, and so forth. And we do need a cultural shift in the sense that we do need to have an understanding that it is a benefit to the discipline, to the research endeavor, when you share your data and when you share your papers. And being able to demonstrate that you did that and that someone else as a consequence did something meaningful, that's something that should count in those evaluations. And that requires not just a change in behavior for the researcher conducting the work, it also requires a change in understanding for those that are evaluating those researchers. And so we're aware that all of those pieces need to align for this to really be successful.
Very good. So I invite, that's all I have as far as the pre-written questions that came up during your conversation. Do any of our participants online have some questions that they want to unmute themselves and ask? If so, just please unmute yourself. Okay, so well, certainly I've given everyone a lot of food for thought here, and I think that's terrific, and it's a great way to start opening this conversation. I want to, and I had a few comments came through the chat. We have been recording this session. We will be posting it online, so please feel free to share this, the link to the recording with all your colleagues. I'm sure Greg and Loretta would love to have additional conversations with folks in the community. Particularly as you called them, Greg, those first movers, which it sounds like a few departments do have in play. I just want to point out that the next Heads and Chairs webinar is about equity and graduate admission, and that will be on Friday, March 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern time, as usual. And it will be a slightly longer webinar at about an hour and a half. And again, it will be on this platform, and hope that we can generate some conversations. On behalf of Pranoti and myself and Leela and all of AGI and AGU, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and Greg and Loretta, terrific presentation, a lot of stuff to think about, and thank you again for presenting.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for your attention. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Find the librarian. Bye-bye.
Bye.